Part 26. Descending into Static. Chapter 1. The Dying Echoes. The heavy silence of the mountain peak was the first thing to die, and Ilara felt its departure like a physical wound. As she began her journey down the jagged southern face, the crystalline air of the observatory was replaced by a creeping, gray haze that clung to the ridges like a damp shroud. Each step away from the monument felt like a betrayal of the clarity she had just achieved. The long descent begins into the haze, a slow, agonizing dissolution of the starlight that had filled her veins only hours before. The transition was not merely a change in altitude, but a shift in the very frequency of her existence. The higher slopes were still governed by the laws of the ancient world, stone, ice, and gravity, but as she descended, those laws began to fray. The mountain silence yields to tangled dread, as the path ahead grew cluttered with the debris of a frantic, mechanical civilization. Rusted cables snaked across the path like dead vines, and the skeletal remains of old power pylons rose from the mist like gallows. Ilara clutched her cloak tightly against her, but it offered little protection against the growing sense of unease. The warmth of the celestial fire was fading, leaving her cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Chapter 2. The Acoustic Intrusion. As the elevation dropped, the ambient hum of the universe was replaced by something artificial and jarring. The square wave synth performs a grating sound, a jagged acoustic vibration that gnawed at the edges of her focus. It was a sharp, electronic whine that seemed to bleed out of the very rocks. This was the sound of a world that had forgotten how to breathe, a world that communicated in binary bursts rather than the sweeping chords of the cosmic organ. The quiet peace she fought so hard is fled, chased away by the insistent, needle-like frequencies of a technological rock. The sound grew louder as the trail flattened into an old access road. The sequence bass maintains a rapid pace, a relentless, driving throb that mimicked the heartbeat of a panicked animal. It was a quick, aggressive rhythm, cold and stark, echoing off the canyon walls. There was no room for reflection in this tempo. It was a heartbeat designed for machines, for assembly lines, and for the tireless motion of a society that feared the dark. Ilara found her own pace involuntary quickening, her heartbeat sinking to the frantic pulse of the lowlands against her will. Chapter 3. The Concrete Maze. The mountain path finally dissolved into a cracked asphalt road, leading her toward a horizon of jagged steel and flickering light. She steps into the concrete, busy maze, where the sky is narrowed to a thin ribbon of smog between towering structures. The natural world was a memory here, replaced by a labyrinth of grey walls, rusted scaffolding, and neon signs that buzzed with dying gases. It was a place where light is hidden, and the soul is dark, buried under the weight of a billion frantic, disconnected thoughts. The architecture of the city was a testament to the collective anxiety of the Great Collapse. The natural world yields now to hurried lines, every surface designed for efficiency, surveillance, or containment. There were no curves of the hillside or the soft roundness of snowdrifts. There was only the geometry of pressure and of speed. The buildings didn't rise to meet the sky, they rose to block it out, to create a self-contained world where the stars could be replaced by artificial constellations of street lamps and advertisements. Ilara felt the walls leaning inward, a physical manifestation of the city, as desperate need to consume everything in its path. Chapter 4. The Cacophony of the Masses. The sensory assault was overwhelming. As she reached the outskirts of the residential sectors, the city noise consumes the guiding signs, a cacophony of sirens, grinding gears, and the hollow chatter of millions of voices that said nothing at all. She looked for the stars. For the celestial map she had just learned to navigate, but the sky was a blank, glowing ceiling of orange mist. The city was a closed loop, an ego that refused to look upward, content to wallow in its own artificial radiance. She passed groups of people, huddled under the glow of holographic displays. They moved with a synchronized urgency, their faces illuminated by a pale, flickering blue that was a mockery of the light from the observatory. No one looked at her. To them, she was just another shadow in the maze, another piece of data moving through the terminal. The city noise wasn't just loud, it was disruptive. It broke apart her thoughts, shattering the heavy truth she carried into 1,000 jagged pieces. Every horn blast and screeching tire was a strike against the silence she had cultivated on the peak. Chapter 5. The Bitter Seed. This return to the civilized world was a bitter pill to swallow. It plants a disappointing, bitter seed in her mind, a realization that the revelation at the monument might be ignored by a world too busy to listen. She clutched her locket, but it felt cold and lifeless in this environment, a relic of a truth that had no currency in the marketplace of the maze. What use was the knowledge of the stars in a place where people lived and died by the ticking of a digital clock? She saw a small plant growing in a crack in the sidewalk, a sickly, gray weed trying to find a patch of light amidst the shadows of the skyscrapers. It was the physical embodiment of the bitter seed, a symbol of life struggling in a world that had become hostile to the organic. Elara knelt to touch its leaves, but they felt like plastic, coated in a layer of soot and oil. Even the earth here had been paved over and poisoned, forgotten by those who walked upon it. She felt a wave of profound sorrow for the weed, for herself, and for the world that had chosen the maze over the mountain. Chapter 6. The Erasure of the Sky. The vastness she had felt at the peak began to shrink, the final promise of the hopeful skies. That sense of being a navigator of the infinite felt like a hallucination. It is lost within the motion and the hum, drowned out by the constant, low-frequency vibration of the city's power grid. She moved through the crowds, a stranger to her own kind, carrying a light that no one seemed to notice. The hopeful skies were a myth here, a story told to children who had never seen the night without the interference of a billion flickering screens. She reached the industrial heart of the city, where the geometry of pressure reached its peak. Massive pipes pulsed with toxic coolant, and the air was thick with the smell of scorched copper. The hurried lines of the transport rails cut through the air above her, carrying trains that moved with a predatory speed. Everything was designed to keep people moving, to prevent them from stopping and looking at the grey void where the heavens used to be. The motion was a distraction, a way to avoid the terrifying silence that Elara had embraced on the mountain. Chapter 7. The Settlement of Static. By the time she reached the city center, the transformation was complete. The simple static settles in her eyes, a flickering veil of interference that blurred the edges of the world. She no longer saw the stars. She saw only the flickering of screens and the dull, pulsating glow of street lamps. The clarity was gone, replaced by a grey noise that filled every corner of her consciousness. It was as if the city's broadcast was overriding her own soul, replacing the starlight with the frantic signal of the grid. This was the final price of what she has become. To be the guardian of the monument was to be forever alienated from the world below. She was a creature of the heights, now trapped in the depths of a technological winter. The static was her new atmosphere, a constant reminder of the distance between the truth she held and the reality she lived. Every face she passed was a study in distraction, their eyes filled with the same flickering gray that now clouded her own vision. They were all prisoners of the static, but they didn't even know they were in a cell. Chapter 8. The Ghost in the Terminal. She found a small alleyway, a crack in the geometry where the shadows were deep enough to hide in. She leaned against a wall of damp, soot-covered brick, listening to the sequenced bass thrumming through the ground. It was the sound of a world running out of time, yet moving faster than ever. The irony was a weight in her chest, a heavy sorrow that had followed her down from the peak, but had now transformed into something more cynical, more jagged. The square wave synth sound intensified, a high-pitched whine that seemed to come from the very air she breathed. It was the sound of data, of millions of useless signals crossing the airwaves, creating a fog of information that choked the spirit. Elara closed her eyes, trying to find the silence of the mountain, but it was buried under layers of electronic grit. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, a remnant of a more meaningful era that had been overwritten by the static of the present. Chapter 9. The Final Price. She reached the central transit hub, a cavernous space of glass and steel where thousands of people moved in synchronized chaos. The noise here was a physical force, a roar of engines and footsteps that drowned out thought. Elara stood at the center of the hub, a pillar of stillness in a sea of motion. She looked at her reflection in a glass wall. Her eyes were no longer reflecting the starlight. They were filled with the dull, flickering gray of a dead channel. The final promise was not a reward, but a burden. The price of her journey was the inability to ever truly return to the world of men. She was a channel for a signal that no one else could hear, a navigator of a sky that no one else cared to see. As she sat on a cold, metal bench, watching the digital clocks count down toward an arbitrary midnight, she realized that her mission wasn't over. She had to survive the static. She had to keep the spark of the monument alive in the heart of the maze, even if it meant living as a shadow in the terminal. Chapter 10. The Waiting for a New Dawn. The nocturnal hours of the city were not dark. They were a sickly, artificial orange. Ilara waited for the breaking of the day, but she knew that in the maze the dawn would be just another shade of gray. The natural world was far away, a dream she had once had on a mountain peak. Here there was only the hum, the static, and the final price of being the only one who remembered the light. She reached into her pocket and felt the locket. It was the only thing that felt real in this world of illusions. She closed her eyes, and, for a brief moment, the static receded. She heard the faint, distant echo of the pipe organ, a low and heavy chord that reminded her of who she was. She was Ilara. She was the witness. And though she was surrounded by the noise of a dying world, she carried the silence of the stars within her. She would wait. She would endure the static until the world was ready to look up again. The mountain peak is left behind in gray. A heavy haze descends to shroud the stone. The starlight in his veins begins to fade as he descends the jagged path alone. The ancient laws of ice and wind depart, to yield to rusted wires and tangled dread. A square-wave synth performs a grating part, while mechanical rhythms thrum within his head. He steps into the concrete busy maze, where light is hidden and the soul is dark. The natural world is lost in hurried lines, without a single flame or celestial spark. A simple static settles in his eyes, the final price of truths he came to know. He hides the silence of the hopeful skies, while waiting for a dawn to truly glow.